Here, as Katrina said, I am a naturalist by trade for about 2 decades now. Started at the Nashville Zoo. I've worked with Walden's Puddle and Harmony Wildlife Rescue, and still run rescues and releases for them, as well as working with Appalachian Bear Rescue extensively in the last year. I'm a director of communications for TennGreen Land Conservancy, and I'm out and about in our bear habitats across the state on a weekly basis. I love everything about it. Worked with the National Park Service in the past as a nature journalist, all kinds of fun stuff. And as Katrina said, I am a bear enthusiast. I love bears. And this time we're going to talk about coexisting with black bears in a changing Appalachia. So one thing I want to say up front is I'm really going to talk about what's changed and why. Because if you're on this call and you're an Appalachian Bear member, or you're just someone that knows and loves us at Appalachian Bear Rescue, chances are you know all about Bearwise. You know all about habituation. You know all about all of the things that we're experiencing in Gatlinburg, Asheville, Townsend, everywhere on a daily basis. You're in the know. So I'm not going to bore you guys with things that we already know. We'll touch on some of it towards the end. But I'm really going to dive into what's changed and why for Ursus americanus, which is our black bears, and eastern black bears are the Americanus americanus. So just to go ahead and dive right in, we've got these two maps right here. And this is a range change that is responsible for everything. Black bears historically ranged over most of the forested regions of North America, including all Canadian provinces, Alaska, all states in the United States, and significant portions of Mexico. Their current distribution is restricted to relatively undisturbed forest regions. So what changed? Okay, like what is this drastic change that we're seeing? If you look at that map on the left, there's a whole lot of green. You look at that map on the right, as we know today, the recent range, not much going on in the US, a whole lot still going on in Canada. This drastic change, as we all know, was directly caused by European colonization and the fallout that continues. And the most shocking thing to me is if you think about that historic range, the reason I wanted to put these two maps up here is because that historic range is millions of years. The black bear species has existed for at least 1 million years on this continent, if not 2 million or 3 million years, depending on who you ask. Research is always ongoing. We're always finding new evidence. So compare that millions of years to a recent range from the last 250 years. And that's what continues to blow in my mind every single time I see this. So when we talk about this just absolutely massive change for this species and pretty much every other species in this range, we're talking about the last 250 years, maybe 300, maybe 400, but really the last 250 have just been a real hard time for our black bears and for a lot of us, let's be real. So what's changed and why? If you look at this map, the black bear is still the most widely distributed bear species in North America, yes. But if you look at this USGS map, we're really seeing an occupancy in at least 40 US states and all Canadian provinces except Prince Edward Island and portions of northern Mexico as well. But this, to me, is pretty egregious. If black bears were thriving in all of these pink, purple areas, that'd be great, but they're not. The populations have bounced back, but as Greg can tell you and Katrina can tell you, and I can tell you, it's in very densely populated pockets, forest islands, and places that they can still thrive and survive, and then also in our urban areas where they become habituated. But historically, our black bears lived across almost all of the forested areas of the continent. And when we look at that modern range now, it's roughly 60% of their historical territory in the United States. Again, I think that's pretty generous. 60% is a big number. I just don't think that that's accurate, but hey, that's what we're sticking to on the maps. So I'll stick with the facts that you're going to see everywhere else. But the shock really to me is about 45% of that extant terrain in that 60% is Canada. 15% is the US. And you can really see that on these maps on the previous slide where you still got all that green up in Canada. And then it's just a patchwork down here in the US. So European colonization, just the most fun topic in the whole wide world. And there's a bunch of historic illustrations of black bears out there. I've chosen just a couple, one with Teddy Roosevelt, who actually stepped up for our black bears after a very checkered history with the species as well as bison. But that's a topic for a whole nother day. You can see an illustration there of some lovely Victorian Americans looking at a black bear in the middle of a downtown, a dancing bear from some American Russians. These shows took place across the country, not just in the old world. And this was all happening while the bullet points on the right were happening. And mass extermination through unregulated hunting and predator eradication campaigns was just so detrimental to our bears. So European settlers viewed black bears as dangerous competitors and threats to livestock, crops, and frontier expansion. Bears were systematically shot, trapped, poisoned, and killed for bounty programs across much of the eastern North American continent. And this caused severe regional population collapse by the late 1800s. And at the same time, we got large-scale destruction and fragmentation of Appalachian forests. So as this is happening, colonization is just aggressive logging is a good way to put it. Railroad expansion, mining, agriculture, and settlement of cities and townships that eliminated vast tracts of old-growth forest. And as forests were cleared into isolated patches, black bears lost critical denning habitat, food sources, migration corridors, the ability to maintain stable breeding populations, access to their regular food sources, water sources, et cetera, et cetera. A very, very, very prominent example of this is our own Great Smoky Mountains National Park, where the logging took out 90% of the old growth forests. And you have to go up to the Appalachian Trail or the high elevations to see some of the larger trees and incredible forests that used to exist everywhere that these bears were married to and still are. So another thing that's happening at the same time is a collapse of ecological food systems that the bears depended on. Like I mentioned, European land use dramatically altered the mass-producing forests dominated by American chestnut, oak, and hickory. Again, that was a huge occurrence in the Great Smoky Mountains and all of Appalachia. The later destruction of the American chestnut by introduced blight also removed one of the most important seasonal food sources for Appalachian wildlife, worsening starvation pressure and forcing bears into increasing conflict with humans. And I'm sorry this is so depressing, but it's literally the topic. And moving into modern times. So all of this is technically modern history, but we're going to say more modern times. So if you look at a modern geophysical race relief map of the United States, this is what our brain still kind of thinks of as America, right? But in this map, we've got rapid human development pushing bears into closer and more frequent conflict with people. We've got expanding subdivisions, we've got vacation cabins, we've got more vacation cabins, and we've got more vacation cabins, and we've got apartment complexes, tourism, infrastructure, and just the growth at an increasingly alarming rate. And it's being directly built inside historic bear habitat, not just here in Appalachia, but across the country. And as wildland disappears and forest edges multiply, black bears are forced to navigate human-dominated landscapes where access to garbage, roads, and artificial food sources are dramatically increasing, while their natural habitats and food sources are decreasing. And at the same time, the likelihood of conflict, relocation, and euthanasia increases right alongside with it. So while our brains still may think of a US map like this, or perhaps some of our loved ones do, if you've been as scarred by all this information as I have, this is what we should really be thinking of. This is a map of the major roadways in the United States, just the major ones. The whole map turns red because everything is roads. Now, we all know this. It's very hard to go out and find a rural area that isn't carved up by roads. This is our current reality. Roadways fragment habitat and isolate our bear populations, period. And expanding highways and mountain roads carve Appalachian forests into disconnected habitat islands, forcing bears to cross dangerous human corridors to find mates, food, and territory. This fragmentation reduces genetic diversity, it increases stress behaviors and disrupts long-established wildlife movement patterns. And alongside this, vehicle collisions are becoming a major source of black bear mortality. As Appalachian Bear Rescue members know, a lot of the cubs that we take in are orphaned from vehicle incidents. And development spreading deeper into bear habitat. As it does, black bears are increasingly struck and killed on our roadways. And it's created this barrier effect where surviving bears are they're altering their natural movement. And that's a wild concept to me. And their feeding behavior is altered with it to avoid traffic, further shrinking. Greg, I would love for you to hop in with some stories.
Yeah.
I could do the same, but I'd love for them to hear some from you because you've got some amazing ones on this topic.
John, I love everything you're saying right now because I had 2 interviews today, one with the local news and one with a NPR station out of Nashville, and this is like all I've been talking about all day. So especially the roads. But we've got a chat comment here from Denny Long. Denny said, there was a juvenile black bear near the interstate in Chattanooga yesterday. A couple other bears have been sighted in the larger Chattanooga area. I'm worried that it's due to habitat loss primarily. And, Denny, we had a bear at the Maryville Kroger in Maryville. And the Maryville Kroger is between 2 major highways, 129 and 321, and just surrounded by concrete.
There's no trees anywhere.
Yeah, it's surrounded by concrete and asphalt in all directions. Maryville has bears in it, but of all places in Maryville to have a bear, this parking lot is as central and as uncovered as possible. And I told the news today, I was like, hey, look, that bear doesn't want to be there, doesn't want to be on asphalt, doesn't want to be on concrete. And so he's got a hard road to get back to the woods from where he's at. He's not far from it, but Blount County and some of these counties surrounding our cities like Chattanooga, their suburban sprawl is dramatically cutting off wildlife corridors, destroying agricultural land and development of subdivisions where people used to live on an acre now live on 1/5 of an acre, and you've got more road, more driveway, less trees, less what, you can't have a big tree in a subdivision with 1/5 of an acre lots. There's no room for the big tree, right? And that's, with these corridors being destroyed. I-40 is a great example. I-40 through the Pigeon River Gorge is a death trap for bears, and I talked about that today. I-40 got destroyed by Hurricane Helene, and the best thing about that was it probably saved some bears' lives during the reconstruction because there's a lot less traffic on it.
Slower traffic.
And a lot slower traffic on it, But I-40 is a great example. And, John, I don't know if you've seen any of Kristen's data from the I-40 corridor project with the GPS collars on the bears, but when we relocated bears from the park north of I-40, they would get hit crossing I-40 at 10 times the rate of a resident bear around I-40. And that was because the resident bears around I-40 just didn't cross it. And if they did, they crossed it in the safest space they could, and they crossed it very infrequently. And even, some of those residents did get hit, but it was like, 10% chance for a resident, and or I want to say there's a 5% chance for a resident and 50% chance for a relocated bear. So that data, though, showed us the home ranges of these bears, especially females, who literally I-40 was the hard stop for their territory and their range, and they did not cross it. Males may have crossed it some, but seeing that data really put it into perspective just how much some of these barrier effects have on our bears, barrier, bear pun intended, and also other wildlife, right? Because if it affects bears, surely it affects other critters. And that's what I've been telling people all this week. The interviews I've done is if we can measure the health of our bears, it's a good indicator for everything else. And if something is detrimental to our bears, it's probably detrimental to other species.
Yeah, 100%. It's one of the interesting things to me is Greg and I talk about this on and off is just the Mexican armadillos we have here, the 9-banded. That's a pretty good indicator of how dangerous our roads are. Because if you drive anywhere in Tennessee now, you'll see last week when I drove down to ABR from Nashville, I saw 11 and stopped counting. So I literally was seeing so many armadillos hit on I-40 that I just stopped counting. It is this giant swath of consistently 60 to 80 mile per hour conservatively moving cars, cutting the entire state in half, cutting this entire historic range in half. So while all of this that we were looking at, all of this history is extremely important, this is what got our bears from their numbers in the millions, hundreds of thousands, down to the hundreds. And when it got down to the hundreds, we built these roads. We had already decimated their populations before we started building highway systems to an extensive degree during World War II to transport nuclear weapons and vehicles and all kinds of other stuff. I mean, we didn't have interstate systems until the 1900s. And by then, we only had hundreds of bears left in Appalachia. Yeah. So if you look even closer, go ahead.
I was going to say those roads didn't have a whole lot of cars on them until, much more recently, right? An interstate could have had one car driving on it between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m. No one was on on the road in the 1950s and 60s in any great amount from midnight to 6 in the morning, 8 in the morning, there weren't enough people even in some places to create traffic. And now we have interstates that are, 24/7 constant streams of tractor trailers and cars. And maybe we have more bears in some of these areas. We do. We know we have more bears now than we had, but those bears would probably like for it to go back, 50 years in traffic volume. The road is almost okay if they can at least just get across it, but they can't even do that now. It's, I wouldn't take my chances running across I-40 in the gorge with that 6-foot concrete wall dividing it. I mean, I can run and I can jump, but I'm not that confident.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think about, I should have done a slide with 3 maps. So you got millions of years in a historic range on the left. You got a recent range of 250 years. Then we should take a third map on the other side for the last 50 years and show increases in traffic, rapid development. If you think about it in these terms, this is, I have to remind myself constantly and others to step back in conservation and realize we've got millions of years, we've got 250 years, and then we've got the last 50 years since the Endangered Species Act and the complete modern industrial and technological revolution of the United States. So this just tiny, tiny, tiny pocket in existence has changed everything on such a rapid scale that it's insane. So again, like you zoom into Southern Appalachia, this is what it looks like without roads. Boy, don't we wish that this is what, we just had these interstates. You zoom in just a bit and it starts to look like this. I could have kept zooming in. I had 4 slides initially, but I was like, this is overkill. You can just get the point from this to that. That's insane. And that is such a high overview of what we're looking at. This times 10,000, this to the 10,000th power is what all of our wildlife is dealing with. And it's affecting us in just as many ways as it is them, but specifically for black bears who need wide-ranging habitat, cougars, wolves, coyotes, everything. This is detrimental. And to me, this is a big sticking point for me. This is something I talk about a lot. It's now our responsibility to help the cubs and bears affected by our development and existence. And this is why Appalachian Bear Rescue exists. I haven't been around for the 30 years with Appalachian Bear Rescue, but I've lived 37 years on this planet and, grew up in the foothills of the Smokies in Knoxville and Maryville, going around and visiting all these places and worked there as an adult. And I've known about Appalachian Bear Rescue the entire time. So, to work with you guys as an adult is amazing. But also at the same time, I can sit here and think in just those 30 years that I can recall how much things have changed. And the reason that all of you want Appalachian Bear Rescue to come back just as badly as we do is because it is our responsibility to help these animals in the reality that we've created that they now have to live in. So if a mom gets hit by a car, if someone says, well, okay, more bears will be born, why do we care? Why are we giving money to Appalachian Bear Rescue? To me, it boils down to exactly this. It is our responsibility. If a bear is orphaned by a human, we give that cub a second chance. We even the scales, right? That's my big hope. That's my big sticking point. And I don't know, Greg, Katrina, if you guys have anything you want to add there.
We didn't prompt him to say that, by the way.
I say that same stuff a lot, John. We're just trying to balance the scales, and really we're not bringing balance to the force with what we're doing in the grand scheme, like you've shown in these pictures. Your little exercise here with the roads, I've done that before and showed people that. I've done that zooming in and seeing like, yeah, look at that. Looks all green and nice there. Then zoom in a little more, right? I've done that. And it's like, all right, where are you going to live? Where's a bear going to live? Where are you going to grow your food? But I tell folks that we don't have to help bears. We have to stop hurting them, right? And you've probably heard me say that. I say that today a lot. But at this point in time, we have to help them a little bit because we've done so much to hurt them indirectly and directly, right? There's not a bear that travels this landscape like you've shown here who hasn't been impacted by human development. Now, is it negative? Is it neutral? Some cases, maybe it's a neutral impact, but for most of them, it's negative. For very few bears, is it positive? Because even the bears who are getting fat and happy off of human food, their demise is imminent, right? We know that. And so, even when a bear has a more natural cause of orphaning and injuring and stuff, if we can help them, it's still not a bad thing to try. And there are bears who we can't help. There's bears we can't catch. There's bears who we won't ever get. There's bears who can't be helped and we end up just putting down. But it's hard to pick up a bear or catch a bear in a trap. If a person has a bear in their possession, if a bear is in someone's backyard, you know what? That bear's life has been impacted by humans, is the way I look at it. And there are bears out there that are naturally orphaned and are naturally scooped up by another bear or a coyote, and they just go circle life like they did for those millions of years in those previous slides. And that's not why we exist. But by far, we're here just to be a little bit of a lifeline, a tiny lifeline in, a world and a map like you've shown here that has stacked all of the odds against bears. And still, because they're such cool, tough animals, they found a way, right? All the odds stacked against them. There's no rehab, rescue efforts, or education efforts that are going to reverse what has been done to them. But we can do a little bit, and it's worth doing a little bit.
100%. And it's one of those things like, okay, is this a statistical question or is it a moral question? Conservation will always be as much of a moral question as it will be a statistical question. Like Greg's saying, like do something, not nothing. And
John,
that's what we do.
I also think about, like, you're saying maybe we can balance the scales a little bit, but one of the other reasons I think that we exist is to tell the story of the bear cubs that come into our possession, right? Because it's one thing to be like, people really enjoy watching our bear cubs grow up, as do we, right? But they, in a perfect world, they wouldn't be with us. We would put ourselves out of business, if we could be as good at our jobs as we'd want to be. But like, it's so hard, when you hear even just numbers, whether it's humans or bears or cats or dogs or whatever, to understand the impact, that even one person's actions can make. But, a couple of years ago, we got 3 bear cubs from a situation where a mom had been, getting into cars and then getting trash and then eventually into a house. And that, those bear cubs eventually were orphaned because the mother got put down. And the neighbor up on the hill of the specific neighborhood, that happened to be a lot of rental cabins, but she actually was like livid after she found out that the mother was put down, right? But like, until you get to that point, sometimes people don't understand, like, oh, bear getting into trash, yeah, it's kind of annoying for us, but it doesn't actually matter. But once then you find out that now these 3 bear cubs are orphaned because of, actions, whether I did it or my neighbor did it, it doesn't really matter in the end of the day. Like, that's how we can convince, I think, people in a lot of ways to change their behavior for, the better of the bears.
Yeah. Without those stories, John, we wouldn't be sitting here around this computer screen talking about what you're talking about, spreading that word, right? Those bears give us the platform to talk about this impact that we're having.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you guys for that. And it's, as Greg was saying, as Katrina was saying, one thing that I talk about significantly with our partners and just with the public and any chance I get really is exactly what Greg and Katrina were saying. We have to be proactive, not reactive. And you'll hear that language everywhere, but it is the key of everything. We've got to teach each other to be proactive for our bears instead of reactive. That means doing things up front, helping them before we hurt them. So let's move on to the next slide. So what's the rapid fallout? This is something that I've been very interested in, and I wanted to show you guys. Again, I wanted to go a little bit more deep into these things instead of just handing over some general information that I'm sure you guys all know. One of my favorite, for the wrong reasons, recent studies was by North Carolina State University and their Wildlife Resources Commission in the state. And they conducted a comprehensive urban-suburban black bear study in the Asheville area over on the other side of the Smokies from us. And this study revealed that urban bears are significantly heavier and reproduce earlier than their rural counterparts. And that doesn't sound like anything earth-shattering until you see the severity of what this study is talking about. So let's dive into some key findings from this multi-year study here, and then we'll discuss. So we're seeing rapid adaptation in the form of accelerated growth and reproduction, chiefly. Researchers discovered in North Carolina that urban bears are nearly twice the size of those in national forests by their second year. This was one of the first times we were able to concretely show this in significant evidence trails. So instead of 100 to 250 pounds, think 300 to 400 pounds. Averaging. That's wild for a black bear. Most of our black bears are much smaller than most people think they are. And then most shockingly to me, it's those urban females, our sows, are giving birth much earlier, some at less than 2 years of age, which is something we're hypothesizing is directly linked to these food sources that they're getting in urban areas, right? But for a female black bear to have a bear cub underneath 2 years of age, or just in 2 years, is wild. So for reference, female black bears typically have their first cubs between 3 and 5 years of age. It can be on the younger side, the older side, or it can be way older than that. The exact age heavily depends on food availability and the bear's weight. You know, if they're well nourished, food-rich areas, all that fun stuff. But then you get these urbanized super bears and giving birth at 2 years, 20 months. That's a big change. And it's one of the reasons why we're seeing an increase in the numbers that we have in Appalachia, which is a good thing. But this is one of those, like, this is a blessing and a curse. But that was, to me, that was the line when I was keeping up with this study and read the published results and everything, to see documented bear cubs at 2 years and younger, sows giving birth, I was like, wow, this is how rapidly we are forcing this species to adapt.
Yeah. And John, I'll tell people 3 years old was still very young for the first litter.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the Smokies, I'd seen females who gave birth at 3. But a lot of bears, their first heat cycle was at 3.5, and then they gave birth at 4. Very few wild, females in the mountains, especially in the mountains where, it's a little bit tougher in the mountains than in some more food rich areas, even in the wilds. Very few bears would give birth at 3. And even if they did give birth at 3, it would typically be a very small litter, 1-2 cubs for that first litter for a 3-year-old. And, those suburban bears in Asheville, they documented a bear just recently having 6 cubs in Asheville. I think it was last year. There was a 6 cub litter, and the bear, she weighed 350 plus pounds probably. But you see these cubs in Asheville, and Gatlinburg has its fair share of them, but Asheville has a lot of these big bears. You see cubs running around at 100 pounds in the fall. That's bigger than the cubs at ABR are by the fall a lot of times, and so it's crazy how rapid they will mature and grow, and their biological age is much more accelerated compared to their chronological age, and their survival is very high at those young ages. But when you go to 5 years old, all of a sudden now it's a hard stop, especially for male bears. A lot of those male bears, they reach 5 years old and they're toast in those suburban environments, because they're going to get into trouble by the time they're 5, and they're going to get shot, killed, put down, you name it. And even a lot of the females are not so lucky. The mothers, the matriarchs tend to have their beat, their path, their territory, and they can survive in those areas because people tolerate them. But then the dispersing offspring are out of luck when they get kicked out, weighing 100, 200 pounds by 2 years old, and they don't have anywhere else to go because mom had, the one spot in town that they could get by.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's summarized in a lot less significant words. It's crazy. And it's the kind of crazy that is both wildly fascinating and very unfortunate to watch at the same time. So what we're seeing here is a sort of survival mode, right? That rapid biological advancement and adaptation. And over here on the left, you see these type of images all the time. These are some of our Appalachian bears living in densely populated North Carolina cities. And this habitat fragmentation, very important term that we've been talking about, is rapidly changing how black bears move, feed, and survive. As Appalachian forests become increasingly divided by roads, neighborhoods, and commercial development, as we've discussed, black bears are forced into smaller and more isolated habitat patches. This disruption alters natural travel corridors, increases stress and competition, and pushes bears into closer contact with humans as they search for foods, mates, and territory. And this is all stuff that we've briefly touched on. So this is kind of to summarize that up. And another thing that we've touched on is food conditioning. And if you look at those images right there, I bet they jump right out at you at the left. We probably all saw those 100 times last year. These were some recent, pretty dangerous encounters with food conditioned black bears in Gatlinburg over the last 2 years. And this is just one of hundreds, a couple of hundreds. And it's this food conditioning and the habituation that follows. These are the leading drivers of our modern bear conflict, as we all know. When bears repeatedly gain access to garbage, bird feeders are a huge one, campsites, pet food, they quickly learn to associate humans with easy calories. And over time, these bears are losing their natural caution around people, which is what habituation means at its core, and increasing the likelihood of property damage, dangerous encounters, relocation, and chiefly euthanasia. Habituation is, the news still struggles to not just frame it as a human problem, but we've got to let everybody know that this is a bear problem. The bears are the ones paying the price, as we talk about all the time. And it's not just through euthanasia, it's by getting hit by a car, being poisoned, all kinds of things that we could do an entire presentation on.
Yeah. John, a lot of folks don't hear about bears being poisoned and, poached and things, right? Because people don't really publicize that stuff, right? In our line of work, we have to be pretty careful if a cub does come to us from a mother bear being poached or, something like that. We can't be spreading that information sometimes because it's sensitive information, maybe, under investigation, things like that. But it has happened, and it happened more in the early days of Appalachian bear rescue. But that being said, when it comes to these conflict bears in general, we had bears from the national park that we collared back when I worked there, and we had bears end up poisoned and dead in a ditch with a collar on. We had bears end up shot, dead in a ditch with a collar on. We had people kill bears, cut the collar off, and toss it in a lake, something like that. And we would get the GPS coordinates, so we would know, most likely this happened here, and then the collar went on a trip. But folks do still poach and get rid of bears out of convenience. And, there are people who call when they kill a bear because it's damaging their property. And there's a lot of people who just kill the bear and don't say anything. And, there's probably more of it than we even think sometimes in these conflict situations.
Yeah, well said. So just to kind of keep you guys abreast, this is my final slide because I really wanted to open this up to discussion because Katrina and Greg and I have a lot of stories and experience here. And a lot of this stuff, if we keep going, we're going to get into bear-wise habituation, which is all incredibly important information, but it's stuff that we're more familiar with. So I think it would be a lot more fun. See if you guys have questions about things and kind of get into that. So for this final slide to lead into that, we'll just wrap this up by saying coexistence is possible. We've shown that. Like Greg was saying and I was saying, we have seen the numbers of our eastern black bears increase dramatically in the 21st century, which is wonderful. So it shows us, we know that modern coexistence in Appalachia is possible, but it requires intentional human responsibility and restraint. And if you're living alongside black bears today, that means adapting to your human behavior, like we were saying, rather than expecting wildlife to just disappear or be okay with being shot or poisoned. Remind your loved ones, okay? Again, like we're all bear wise here, but remind your loved ones, remind the people that you interact with on a weekly basis that we've got to be proactive and not reactive. That means if you see bears in your area, make sure your trash is secured. Make sure your birds don't get fed for the next however long until the bears move on. I know it sucks, but bird seed is God, they can smell it from miles away, and it is a huge source of easy carbs. I always harp on bird feeders because I have them, and I'm just waiting until we have enough bears in Middle Tennessee for me to take the bird feeders down. That to me is a win because the birds they'll be okay. Successful coexistence depends on securing attractants, like we were just saying, protecting those habitat corridors, reducing unnecessary development pressure, and accepting that maintaining a truly wild Appalachia requires space for both people and predators. And we've said it multiple times throughout this presentation, but we've got to all be bear wise to survive together. And I really do think that's possible. And I think that's one of the main inspirational reasons that ABR has got to exist in perpetuity. So that's it for that. And I just wanted to say thank you guys for supporting black bear conservation. Let's get to some questions. Specifically, if anybody found all of this wonderful, interesting urban bear study is fascinating as Greg and Katrina and I do.
We got one comment here from Kirsten Vegas. She said, sadly this morning, Good Morning America showed a cute clip in quotes about a bear trying to get into a cabin's kitchen. I saw this clip. Someone sent it to me. The renter eventually sprayed it with water to get it out of the window and then closed the window. Which is bad for the bear. I'm sure on the TV show, everyone thought it was cute. And you know what? You're exactly right, Kirsten. People think that's just cute and fun. And you know, a lot of people watching that clip have no idea that that bear is going to be dead if it's caught by the state authorities wherever it happened. You know, especially if it's in Tennessee.
It was in Gatlinburg.
Oh, it was in okay. Mm-hmm. I promise you that bear will be dead if it is caught by the state authorities in the state. I have that on good authority. No pun intended, but that's just how things are done here. And, you know, most people don't know that, right? And Good Morning America isn't interested in that. They're interested in clicks and views and likes on that type of footage. And we've come a long way, and you guys deserve a lot of credit because I know that you guys get on people's comments and pages when people are posting stuff trying to be cute, and you tell them, hey, that's not good for the bear. And, you know, Daryl Radijak has a big thing about saying, you know, not cool, right? And putting it out there that stuff's not cool when people post it, right? We don't want to give that stuff more of a platform. And I've been seeing the change. I've been seeing the Bearwise propaganda, for lack of better words, take effect. And I've seen you guys out there being that little army online, helping people understand that we don't want to see this stuff. And it's not cool to just take cute clip bear videos of bears doing these bad habituated food conditioned behaviors just for clicks and likes. So thank you. Any questions for John from some of the earlier stuff, some of that 250-year, 10 million year old history? Who wants to talk about Teddy Roosevelt? Because I know John can talk about Teddy, because I can talk about Teddy. Mary says, I'd like to read the Urban Bear Study. Can you email a link to the NC?
Yeah.
Let me, is that stuff all public domain, John?
It is, yeah. And I've linked to it here in the presentation. And I'll make sure that you guys have the whole presentation just like last time, and anything that would be really interesting for the reading. See where it's underlined right there. That's a link so you can go read it for yourself. So glad you guys do that. That's why we love you guys, because you're interested. You actually want to read more. And even if you know that some of us may know what we're talking about, you always want to read the information for yourself. And that's the most important step, in my opinion. So yes, long story short, we will 100% be sending all of this y'all's way. Does anybody else have any questions? Anything that's interesting? Anything that you thought was surprising, shocking? Personal stories? Likes, dislikes?
You guys can turn on your heartbreak. You guys can turn on your camera and your microphone and tell us your bear story. You got 18 minutes here of our undivided attention.
You'll have to listen to Greg fill it if you don't.
Or else I'm gonna run with this. I've been talking all day, but I got more in the tank.
Yeah, I have a story.
Nah, well, Katrina, we didn't open the floor for you. I'm kidding. Okay. Go ahead.
So this was one of the things that driving in the park, it gets my blood boiling, because consistently, I mean, you see people being stupid around bears all the time, but most recently it was not the most helpful interaction on my part. I will put that out there to begin with, but I was driving down the Gatlinburg bypass, and this is one of the more common areas this time of year to see bears, especially roadside, eating. And one of the big things is that we have, we're in spring, right? And so we haven't hit the berry season yet here in East Tennessee. And so bears are literally finding whatever they can. And a lot of that is, you know, actually just eating like roadside grass and forbs and things like that. And so I was driving down the bypass, and I see this car, and it's pulled off in this kind of odd spot. And I was like, there has to be a bear. Now, nobody else was stopping, but of course I pulled past it, and there's this bear that's just right in front of the car, like right in front of the car. Well, rather the car is right behind the bear because the bear's doing whatever it's doing. But anyway, so I pass it, and I was actually on the phone with Greg, and I go, should I be a Karen and turn around and tell those people to keep moving? Now, I'm not in any sort of official vehicle at all. I'm just in my little Toyota Corolla Cross, bright blue. And so I end up, I pass it and I was like, okay, I'm just going to go ahead and turn around and just tell these people just keep moving. They're probably not going to listen to me, but I'm going to at least get off my conscience. And so I turn around, and I head up the hill and I roll my windows down and I was like, hey guys, like, can you just keep moving? It's really disrespectful to that bear to be up in its grill and doing all this thing. And then, this person's filming the bear and turns the camera to me and he's like, it's not bothering the bear. And I think that's like one of the biggest things that gets me about bear habituation and bears, quote unquote, getting in trouble here in East Tennessee, but really anywhere, is that, oh, well, the bear doesn't care, right? And it's like the bear is trying to eat food in a time of the year where it's really hard to find something, and now it's found something on the side of the road, and it's become like it's worth it for this bear to have a car literally up in its grill with phones, multiple phones facing it, and that bear is just going to keep eating, and it's not going to probably bluff charge the car, and it's probably not going to move because it's found food, right? And so I think that's just a good thing for us to think about, like even for any sort of wildlife. It may not be bothering that bear, but now that bear's, maybe it's going to have enough of this car and it's going to quickly cross the road on this really busy, curvy, windy road. And now it's going to get hit by a car. Right. And so that interaction didn't go well, and it didn't end up doing anything that I wanted it to do, except the people got mad at me for telling them to move along. But I think it's something to just keep in mind that like bear habituation turns into bears, getting into these spaces of humans where then they eventually either get put down or they get hit by a car or they, XYZ. And so I think that was, I don't know what the point of my story was, but essentially just because the bear's not bothered doesn't mean that it's not harmful to the bear.
Yep. 100%. And while Katrina has been letting us know, her trials and tribulations, which we need to hear more of, by the way, Katrina. You've got lots of them, and you're very well-versed and intelligent, and people want to hear from you. So let's have you teach a class. While she's been doing that, I've been dropping some of the links. I realized that I linked to my personal access, so I don't think the full study is public, but there's a lot of really great published material drawing from it. So I've been dropping those links in the chat over here. And like Katrina said, we'll make sure and get those out to you guys.
We have a comment from someone whose name's not with their comment, but it says, it's shocking to me with all the construction in the Chattanooga area that we're still seeing young bears being dispersed. I'm wondering where they are while they're getting to that age. Hundreds of acres a year are being covered with new housing around here. Yeah. Some of those young bears could be traveling some pretty substantial distances too. When you see a young bear show up in Chattanooga, it could have come from deep in South Cherokee National Forest and traveled, 50 miles to get to Chattanooga from the National Forest land. And chances are he's going to turn around and go back because he's run out of habitat. But, they can easily get into trouble or get hit by a car on those trips. But those young males looking for territory, like the one that I had to talk about being in Maryville yesterday, those bears are in those areas for a reason. And it's because there's too many bears back where he came from. Mom kicked him out maybe last year, maybe the year before, maybe he's a 2-year-old, 3-year-old male. Other bears beat him up. He's got nowhere else to go. And so he goes until he runs out of rope. Quite literally, you run out of road, run out of rope. And then they try and find a way to make a living. And maybe some of them go back to the mountains and find some refuge, and some of them don't. So Mary says, follow up on the cougar presentation. So we had a cougar presentation, John, with Daryl Radijak that everyone really liked. She said a cougar and 3 kittens were seen on a trail camera in Minnesota. First time in 100 years. Voyager's Wolf Project captured the video. That's pretty cool. Katrina,
I love Voyagers. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for that update. That's
Katrina's a
awesome.
big
I watched
fan.
the presentation. It was awesome. I was just as interested to see
Oh, John knows.
what you had to say
He
as
knows.
everybody else.
As you guys know, Katrina has family from northern Minnesota. She's a big fan of up north, and we have always said, John, Minnesota doesn't say they have breeding populations of Minnesota of cougars, right? They've always said it's transient males kind of roam in from North Dakota. Obviously, there's not far as the cougar travels, but northern Minnesota is one of those few relatively intact ecosystems, and Voyager's Wolf Project and those folks do a great job up there documenting all that wilderness, and that's one of the holdouts really in our, if you're going to call it the Eastern U.S., Minnesota is kind of the only holdout in the Eastern U.S. with a complete intact ecosystem on that northern border. So pretty cool. Another one here. Denny Long replying to Kirsten. I've been keeping up with that, Kirsten. I think Toron's pressed too close to bears. Kirsten was talking about the bears in Montana, Glacier and Yellowstone, some of those attacks. Those sound like defensive encounters from what I've heard of those attacks. They've been, bump into on trail. And, with grizzly bears, that's a fact of living in grizzly country. You bump into a grizzly bear on a trail, you could be doing absolutely nothing wrong, but it's the wrong place, the wrong time. And man and grizzly have had that going on for as long as man and grizzly have interacted in shared spaces. And it's sad in those situations, people get killed or even hurt. But that is part of being in a wilderness area, true wilderness. And one of the things that makes those places wild is that fear, is that sense of I could bump into a grizzly bear, right? And if you haven't been up in the wilds of Montana or Wyoming, if you haven't been out in the dark in the middle of Yellowstone like I have, you may not know what that fear of the wild really feels like, and there's not a lot of places you can go and experience it. And we have to remember that those occurrences, although they're very far and few in between, are actually natural. Those defensive encounters between man and bear where the bear wins are natural encounters that man and grizzly bear have had for actually thousands of years, right, John? That's stuff that happened thousands of years ago. And as much as the conflict with development, encroaches on these bear areas, going into the wilderness, the true wilderness, and interacting with those bears, that's one of the risks you're taking when you go and recreate in those places. The Turons, as you say there, Denny, I've dealt with many of them, and Grizzly 399 was an interesting project, and I tell people those habituated, those bears that are used to the roadsides, they're really not the dangerous ones. Those are the bears that have lost a lot of their wildness. The bears near the roads that are habituated, they've lost some of that wild behavior. It's the ones that are still truly deep in the wild where the danger and the unpredictability exists. So thank you, Denny, for that comment. And I agree with you. It's getting a little bit too busy out here in East Tennessee. Whoever said that. Too much development. Yeah, Denny says too much development. Farmland being cleared daily. Denny, I'm with you, brother. I wish I could keep my hands on some farmland over here. I know John does too, but they're putting in some new cabins just down the road from me on what was a hayfield here in Wares Valley, and I just saw them start excavating. And I was yelling on the phone to Katrina. I'm like, dang it, they started, so it's a shame. And all we can do is keep on being a voice for these resources in our wildlife, and, hope that people with more money and more power than us take notice and consider the plight of the bears and all of our other resources. I'll tell you this, it's sad to see people call for culling bears, right? John, you've been seeing that. People like that, there's too many of them. And it's like, man, do you think the bears get together and have like little meetings and they're like, hey guys, we decided there's too many people. It's like, man, they had that meeting 100 years ago. And yes, you know what? They've been on the losing end ever since. So you gotta think about that when you start calling for culling, you start calling for population reductions because of this encroachment and habitat and stuff. We got to think here, like, man, there's 2,000 bears in the Smokies and 14 million visitors. What's the problem? Not a hard sell, right?
Yep. Well said. Oh man. And yeah, just on the grizzly topic, that's one of the reasons why Bearwise exists in the form that it does today at all. It's not only to kind of round in and wrangle in all of the information and misinformation for black bears themselves, but black bears in general. Because we had for a long time state agencies giving the same advice for brown bears and black bears. And that's not a good thing, as most of you will know. That's one of the reasons that I'm so glad to see Bearwise spread as they have, is just to get some concise, correct information for black bears and distinctly separate it from survival and just habituation information with brown bears, because it's a world of difference. These animals can look very similar, but and they, genetically are very similar, but their behaviors, their history, everything about them, especially their relationship to the human species, is vastly different.
Yeah,
and that is a topic for a whole nother. That's a class we should definitely teach.
Yeah, we can do a grizzly versus black bear versus polar bear class. Daryl Radijek did a pretty good talk, right, where he was talking about all three, didn't he? He was just talking about distribution when we had Daryl talk the first time. All right, well, we can talk more about it. I've got a friend who works with grizzly bears very exclusively, and I know someone who works with polar bears I might be able to invite on, maybe, but
do it. Man, I don't know. Polar bears are in a whole different. That's a monster. That's a real. I love polar bears, and they're beautiful, and we have to save this species. But like, I want to see them from the furthest distance away for the rest of my life. If you want to talk about a bear species that'll just eat you, it's polar bear. We love our polar bears. They're like, I say, monsters with love. That's a whole different ball game. It's like black bear, grizzly bear, and then polar bear is like,
as it was described to me. This polar bear researcher who I know said, they're an obligate carnivore, right? They see a person out across the ice, you're prey. Like, that's what any other animal is to a polar bear. That's just what it is, So
It's not personal.
yeah, it's not personal. And they will still avoid, when it comes to numbers, polar bear will still avoid people in numbers. They still do that sizing up, but I don't ever want to stand 100 yards away from a polar bear across the open tundra. I've stood 50 yards away from a grizzly bear in the Rockies, Northern Rockies before. And, I don't like that either, but I'm okay being 50 to 100 yards away from a grizzly bear, but I would not want to be anywhere within 100 yards of a polar bear. So we can do a class about that, guys. That'll be a lot of fun to talk about that. If I can get some people to join us from Montana and from Canada, that would be really fun. So I'll try and work those angles. But I tell folks, John, with the grizzly bears and black bears, you can see how people didn't tolerate grizzly bears in the Western U.S. by how few their numbers got to be so quickly, right? And black bears were tolerated for a much longer period of time in larger numbers, but grizzly bears were not tolerated, and that was a lot to do with those defensive encounters with grizzly bears, and then predation on livestock, in large numbers. But those defensive encounters pretty much put an end to grizzly bears right off the bat. All right. Well, Kirsten says these sessions are great. Thank you so much for putting the huge effort into doing them. Denny says they got demonized unfairly. You're right, Denny. The grizzly bears really got blamed.
Greg
for
calls
a lot.
it grizzly propaganda.
I do call it grizzly propaganda. I think that people are much more afraid of grizzly bears than proportionally they should be in general. But there's definitely healthy fear there with grizzly bears, but it kind of gets over publicized, in my personal opinion. So polar bears probably justified, right, John? Fear of polar bears. I don't have evidence to say.
Be afraid of all bears, right? just leave them alone. Be afraid of all of them. Let them live their life. We love them. Let them be wild. But Kirsten, thank you. We're very happy to put this effort in. In the two that I've done, I love doing it, and I know these two amazing folks love doing it too. Denny, thank you for saying it as well, man. You guys are awesome. but yeah, I think that's a great place for me to wrap up at least. And I mean, the only thing I would say on the brown bear front is I do think that's at least a brown bear black bear talk that we should have, because I talked to some very educated folks, some very influential folks on a very regular basis that think that we have both brown and black bears in the state of Tennessee. So it's one of those things you never want to overestimate. You don't want to punch down and shame people for it, but you don't want to overestimate that knowledge base either. I think some people could get some good information there. So thank you guys for having me again. Let's do it all the time, but not too often, but nice sweet spot. Yeah. You guys are the best.
All right.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks everybody.
See you guys. Let me stop the recording.